Welcome to week 2 of your curriculum instruction and assessment course. This week we're going to look at planning with a purpose, with really diving into what is backwards design and looking at objectives. So here's our agenda for today. So what is backwards design? Aligning instruction to standards, and we're going to use the North Carolina ones, and measurable and specific objectives, and then elements of lesson planning. So when you first think of a unit, you really want to dive into these things that I've listed up. So main purpose, what do you want the students to understand? And then performance objectives. Are they going to have to create something? How are they going to show or demonstrate their knowledge of this concept? Then content outline. How are you going to break this down? And we're going to go into this, but these are things that you need to think about when you are developing a unit. Then procedures and activities. So how are you going to teach this along with instructional aids and resources? Does it come from a book that you're given from your county or your school? Or is it something that you have to find? Those kind of depend on your school. For instance, in my first school, we weren't given like any resources, so we had to find everything. Then my next school gave us resources that we could use, but we didn't have to use. And then my last school that I was at gave us very specific instructions and resources that we were required to use. So it really varies, and I've been at all different extremes. I would say that I like the one where they give you resources, but you're not required to use them. It kind of gives you that authenticity, but it also gives you a guide. Anyways, and the last one is assessments. These vary from school to school, county to county, state to state. Some of these assessments are countywide. Some of them are just a teacher gives them. It just depends. So just a little fair warning. So when we first look at what do we need to teach, we are first going to look at the standards. And for our sake, we're going to use North Carolina standards. Then you're going to look at the unpacking document. And I've broken this down a little bit more in my next slides. But first you want to understand the standards, then look at the unpacking document. The unpacking document should be like your best friend your first few years of teaching. It really shows you how the students need to know this, the way they're going to be assessed. It gives you very specific guidelines. Then you're going to want to think very broad of how are you going to break down this standard. Are you going to have to break it up into 2 different parts and assess it in 2 different parts? Or is it a very small standard where you can add in another standard? So think very broad, but you want to break it down so you know when you're designing your assessment, which is the last component, that you are making sure that you have all of the elements of your standard, which you would see from the unpacking document. But your assessment, either you can design it, your district, sometimes your grade level, it just depends on your school. I have been more in situations where it's a common assessment among the grade level. At my last school, I was the only 5th grade science teacher, so I made all of mine, but I used other counties just so that I made sure that I could look at data, and we're going to talk about that later on in the course, but really making sure that your assessment aligns with those standards. That's what it means to be backwards. So your backwards is your assessment is where you want your students to be. Now, how are you going to fill in those gaps? So first, we're looking at the standards. I just picked a random one. Fractions are never, or I would say rarely, a student's favorite concept. But for me, I really like fractions and I really like teaching them. So I just picked a 3rd grade fraction standard. So you can see it talks about interpret unit fractions with denominators, and they give you the denominators, which is great. So you don't have to use 10 or 12 or anything like that. It gives you those specific things. And then you have to explain those in parts. But I feel like this is a lot of kind of mumble jumble. So this is the standards. Now our second step was to look at the unpacking document. And this is all things that you can find online. Literally, you can Google North Carolina third grade math unpacking document, and it pulls it right up. I took this screenshot from online. But this is the unpacking document for that third grade standard. So you'll see over here, it has the clarification of what exactly the students have to know. Then for checking for understanding, this is how they're going to be assessed. So you'll notice that they don't just use circles or little bears or anything like that. They use squares and rectangles, but they also use a ruler, which many people, if you were to just look at that standard, you might not think about using an actual ruler. So we want to make sure that we are showing that throughout our lessons and making sure that we are preparing them. So now we're going to break it down and see if we need to have more than one standard to assess, or do we need to break down the standard to have several assessments? I would just choose this as one assessment. I might even add in the next one, but third grade, they're not used to fractions, so I would do it as just one unit to develop my assessment. So I would start it off with, what exactly is a fraction? Okay, talk about numerators, talk about denominators. What does a fraction actually mean? And then I want to show them and actually have them model the length model, which is the number line or the ruler, and then the area model. So different shapes. Don't just use circles. Don't just use rectangles or squares. They need to see a variety of shapes. Then interpret fractions. Sorry, I don't know why that was more just challenging. Interpret those fractions using these specific denominators. That's when you're just writing them out on the board, and then they can either draw them or tell them what it means, that sort of thing. And then application. This is where they will see more of their test style questions. You should be throwing in application throughout, but at the end of the lesson, or end of the unit, you should have a lot of application. So I have found some released EOG questions that are on this standard, and you will see this is an easier question. Okay, it's just looking at, do they understand what equal parts are? Okay, and notice this is a triangle. So you want to show different shapes. So this answer is D, but if they didn't understand equal parts, they would be counting and they would be like, oh my gosh, I don't know which one to choose. So making sure that they understand those equal parts. Then this one's a little bit more challenging. And again, this was on an released EOG. So this was on somebody's EOG. They are looking at what part of this figure is shaded. But they have to understand that they have to split all of these rectangles in order to get the correct answer. Many of them would not do that. So when you're developing your assessments and your practice, you need to make sure that you're putting in similar questions, not this exact question. I mean, you could just to practice, but having different shapes like this, and they have to split them up. This will really help them on questions that they might not think that this would be a fraction question. And this answer is C. Now we're going to move into elements of lesson planning. So this is a whole lot of information, and I apologize for that, but I will kind of break it down into more of a simpler form, but these are the elements of a lesson plan. So first is just gaining their attention. You want them to really engage, pique their curiosity, get their attention on what you're about to learn about. Instead of walking up, today we're going to learn about fractions. Well, why don't you have a whole bunch of different items in front, and you start mixing them together. And I have 1/4 of this, and just talking about that, and that'll really pique their interest. Then you're going to let the learners know what they are learning about. So it could be as simple as, today we're learning about fractions, or today we're expanding on our knowledge of fractions and looking at fractions with the denominator of 8, however you want to do it. But this is a really quick thing that you're just going to say. Then you are going to kind of review what you've already done, see what they know. If they don't know anything about fractions, that's okay. But more than likely, somebody in the classroom is going to know a little bit about the topic. And that really piques their curiosity, and that kind of goes with the gaining interest. Then this is your part as a teacher. You are going to do the teacher input. Way back when it was, we were learning about lesson plans in college, or I was, this was called the teacher input. And this is where you are going to model or actually teach them. So you are up modeling how to show the difference between a numerator and a denominator. I'm just trying to use that same example. And this could have several different ways to do this. But this lesson plan format is mostly for math, ELA, and social studies. We'll go over the science one at the end, and you will go more in depth with that in your science course. Then the next component of your lesson plan is your check for understanding, making sure that they are starting to grasp that concept. And that's when they're starting to work in pairs, or they do a few, then you go over them. It's that guided practice part. And you start to evaluate, are they getting it? And if you need to reteach or move forward, and then you're giving that feedback based on what you saw during their guided practice. And you could extend their knowledge, or you could give them more practice problems, and then you go into that independent practice, which is them really showing off what they have learned. And this could be just a little quick check at the end of the lesson. This could be their homework, or this could be an assessment at the very end. But you will want to check their understanding all throughout the unit. That would be your formative assessment, and we'll talk more about that. So I know that seems like a whole lot, but I have made a lesson plan template, and it kind of breaks it down for you a little bit more and just gives you a little bit more of organization. So you have your subject, then you have your unit. So it could be just fractions. Then your standard, and you'll just copy that from the NC standards. And then your objective. Students will be able to, or it's sometimes I can, however your school decides. So students will be able to identify fractions or interpret fractions with 2, 4, 6, 8 as the denominators. I just pulled that straight from the standard. Then you're looking at academic vocabulary. That's where you really use your unpacking document. And then how are you going to assess them? Next component of your lesson plan is the hook, or how are you going to engage them? Then instead of all those different components of the lesson plan, you are going to do I do, which is you as the teacher. How are you going to teach it? We do, meaning you and the student. And then you do, meaning the student. What are they going to do to assess it? Then your closure. So how are you going to close this out? How are you going to wrap things up? Put a little bow on it if you think of a package that way. But we will practice this a whole bunch. And for science, they use a little bit different method because they're using more of a inquiry-based learning. And so it's very similar, but it's the 5E, which engagement, which is very similar to your hook, which just engages the students. Then exploration. So instead of going into the teacher input, the students are actually going to do a hands-on activity. And this way they can truly invest and take ownership of their learning. Then the teacher is going to explain what they're learning, and the students are going to explain what they found in the exploration. Then the teacher is going to elaborate, or elaboration component is where the teacher introduces that activity to further their knowledge on what they did during the exploration, and then evaluate, which is the assessment part. So it's a little bit thinking of backwards, of them exploring before giving that teacher input. But we will talk more about that during your science. More than likely, I will be your science teacher when that comes. But when you are designing your lessons, think about where your students need to be, and then how are you going to get there? That's the backwards component of it. So if you have any questions, please let me know. And I hope you have a wonderful week.